If you have $5, I'll quit right now." The word snapped across the store like a rubber band pulled too tight, loud enough to bounce off the glass doors and the humming refrigerators, and for a second even the barcode scanner seemed to hesitate before chirping again. Brandon Cole leaned one elbow on the counter, smirking like the line was rehearsed, like he'd been waiting all morning for someone exactly like this to walk in and give him a reason to use it, and the someone was standing there now, soaked from a light spring rain that hadn't quite turned warm yet, a tall black man in a worn grey coat, water dripping from the hem onto the tile in small, patient dots, each one catching the overhead light before disappearing into the scuffed floor. A couple near the coffee station laughed first, soft and unsure, then louder when Brandon didn't back down, and within seconds the sound spread, a ripple of amusement that filled the space between aisles of chips and discount cereal, phones lifting just slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to record something that might be worth sharing later. The man didn't move right away, didn't shrink the way Brandon clearly expected, just stood there with one hand resting on the edge of the counter, fingers steady, as if he were feeling the surface, grounding himself in something solid while the room tilted toward him. The smell of burnt coffee hung in the air, mixed with the sharp, clean sting of disinfectant, and somewhere near the back a freezer door slammed shut, the echo carrying forward like punctuation. Brandon straightened a little, encouraged by the attention, his voice sharpening as he gestured loosely at the man's coat. "Come on, man, you heard me, $5, and I'm out the door." And there it was again, the laughter, louder this time, easier, because now it had permission, now it had a rhythm, and the man, Elias Carter, though no one here knew his name, lifted his eyes slowly, not angry, not pleading, just present, like he was taking inventory of everything in the room, the faces, the cameras, the exit sign glowing green above the door. Behind the register, Nina Brooks paused mid-scan, a carton of eggs balanced in her hand, her thumb hovering over the screen, because something about the way he was looking at Brandon didn't match the script everyone else had already accepted, and she felt it before she understood it, a small, quiet misalignment in the moment. Elias shifted his weight slightly, the wet fabric of his coat whispering against itself, and for a brief second his gaze flicked past Brandon to the bulletin board on the wall, employee notices, schedules, a faded poster about customer service standards, then back again. As if confirming a detail only he could see, Brandon followed the glance but didn't register anything important, just rolled his eyes and tapped the counter with 2 fingers, impatient now. "What, you checking your pockets?" he said, and a few people chuckled again, softer this time. Watching more closely, Elias exhaled, slow and even, the kind of breath that steadies a room if anyone is paying attention, and then he spoke, his voice calm, carrying just enough to cut through the noise without raising itself. "You really want to make that bet in front of all these cameras, and it wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it landed differently, like a note slightly out of key that made the whole chord feel off." Nina's eyes flicked up to the small black dome in the corner of the ceiling, then back to Brandon, who hesitated for half a heartbeat before scoffing, louder than necessary, waving a dismissive hand as if to brush the comment away. "Man, please, don't try to get smart now," he said, though his smile tightened at the edges. "Just enough that someone watching closely might notice." Elias didn't argue, didn't step back either, just stood there in that same quiet way, rainwater still gathering at his feet, his hand lifting slowly from the counter as if the moment had shifted and he needed both hands free now. And for the first time since he walked in, the laughter didn't come right away. It hovered, uncertain, waiting to see what he would do next. Then Elias reached into his coat pocket. Elias did not rush the movement, did not perform it for the room the way Brandon had performed his voice. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his coat with the same steady pace he had used to breathe, and the faint rustle of fabric sounded louder than it should have, as if the entire store had leaned in without meaning to. Nina lowered the carton of eggs onto the counter. Without scanning it, her fingers lingering there, because something about the way his hand disappeared into that pocket felt deliberate, not desperate, and that difference was enough to quiet the last few stray laughs still hanging in the air. Brandon shifted his weight, tapping his fingers again, faster now, like he needed to fill the silence he had created. "What, you got a whole wallet in there?" he said, but the edge in his voice had changed, thinner, stretched. Elias's hand came back out slowly, holding something folded with care, not crumpled, not rushed, just a single bill, its corners aligned as if it had been kept that way on purpose, and for a moment he did not extend it, he just looked at it, then at Brandon, then at the space between them, as if measuring the distance not in feet but in something heavier, a man by the snack aisle stopped mid-step, a bag of chips dangling from his hand. And even the refrigerator hum seemed to settle into the background, giving the moment a strange kind of clarity. Elias lifted the bill slightly, enough for the green to catch the overhead light, and then placed it flat on the counter, not sliding it, not tossing it, just setting it down with a quiet certainty that did not match the story everyone had already decided about him. The bill did not move, but the room did, something subtle shifting as eyes tracked from the man's wet shoes to the money on the counter, and back again. Brandon stared at it for a second too long before forcing a laugh, louder than before but less sure. "Okay, you got $5. Congratulations," he said, though he did not reach for it, his hand hovering instead, as if touching it would make something real that he was not ready to face. Nina's gaze moved between them, then up again to the small black camera dome in the corner, her mind catching up to what her instincts had already told her, that this was no longer just a joke, no longer just a moment to pass time between customers. Elias rested his hand lightly beside the bill, not claiming it, not pushing it forward, simply letting it exist there, a small, quiet object that had suddenly taken on more weight than it should have. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm as before. "You said you would quit," he said, not accusing, not raising the stakes, just stating what had already been said, as if the words themselves were enough. A woman near the coffee station lowered her phone slightly, her smile fading into something more cautious, while the man with the chips shifted his stance, the plastic bag crinkling softly. Brandon's jaw tightened, and he gave a quick glance around the store, as if checking whether the room was still on his side, but the laughter did not return this time. It stayed back, uncertain, waiting for him to lead it again. He forced another grin, pointing at the bill without touching it. "Man, that was a joke. You really think I am going to walk out because of that?" he said, but the confidence in his tone no longer matched the stillness around him. Elias tilted his head just slightly, not in challenge, but in something closer to curiosity, as if he were observing a detail that did not quite fit, and his eyes flicked once more toward the camera, then back to Brandon, the motion small but noticeable now that everyone was watching more carefully. Nina swallowed, her hand finally pulling back from the eggs, because she could feel the shift settling into place, the kind that does not make noise but changes everything that comes after it. A faint gust of air slipped in as the automatic door opened and closed behind someone leaving, bringing with it the cool scent of rain. And for a second it brushed across the counter, over the bill, over Elias's hand, as if marking the moment. Brandon straightened up fully now, crossing his arms as if that would anchor him again, as if posture alone could restore the balance he had just lost, but his eyes kept returning to the money, drawn to it despite himself. Elias did not move the bill, did not repeat himself, he simply waited, his presence steady in a way that made the space around him feel sharper, more defined. Somewhere near the back, a machine beeped twice, unattended, and the sound seemed out of place, like the store itself had forgotten its rhythm. Then Nina glanced at the screen in front of her, and something there made her inhale quietly. Nina's eyes stayed on the screen longer than they should have. Long enough for the glow to reflect faintly in her pupils, and she pressed one button, then another, not ringing anything up, just navigating quietly, as if she did not want to disturb whatever had settled over the store. The system responded with a soft confirmation tone, and a small window opened in the corner of her register display, something most employees ignored because it was rarely relevant to a normal shift, but Nina had been trained well enough to recognize it when it mattered. Brandon noticed the pause. Of course he did, because control was something he tracked instinctively, and when someone stepped even slightly out of line, it pulled his attention like a loose thread. "Nina, you good over there?" he said, his voice carrying a forced casualness that did not quite land, and she nodded quickly without looking up. "Yes, just checking something," her voice quieter than usual. "Careful." Elias remained still, his hand resting beside the $5 bill, not touching it, not withdrawing it, just letting it exist as a point of gravity between him and Brandon. And the longer it stayed there, the less it looked like money and the more it felt like a question that had not yet been answered. A man near the refrigerated drinks shifted his stance again, then pretended to study the labels on a row of bottled tea, but his eyes kept drifting back, drawn by the same quiet tension that had replaced the earlier laughter. Brandon exhaled through his nose, sharp, and uncrossed his arms, placing both hands on the counter as if to reclaim the space. "Look, man, you made your point, okay? You got your $5, great, now just take it and go," he said, leaning forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to suggest he was trying to end things without escalating, but there was still an edge there, still that need to have the last word. Elias looked at him, not with defiance, not with submission, but with a kind of steady attention that made the moment stretch, and when he spoke, it was the same tone again, measured, grounded. "I am not trying to make a point," he said. And for a second that seemed to confuse Brandon more than if he had argued, Nina's fingers hovered over the screen again, then tapped once more, and this time a different panel appeared, one that listed internal alerts, and her eye scanned it quickly, her breath catching just slightly when she saw the small red icon next to one of the entries, because it meant someone above store level had already accessed the system remotely. She swallowed and glanced up, her gaze moving instinctively toward the ceiling camera, then toward the office door at the back that remained closed, its small window reflecting only the fluorescent lights. Brandon followed her glance this time. Just for a fraction of a second, and something in his posture shifted, subtle but real, like a crack forming beneath a surface that had looked solid moments before. Elias noticed it, or at least he noticed the change in the air, because his shoulders relaxed a fraction, not in relief, but in recognition, as if he had been waiting for that exact shift to happen. The store felt smaller now, the aisles closer, the distance between people compressed by attention, and even the sound of rain tapping lightly against the glass doors seemed louder, more present, filling the quiet spaces between breaths. A woman near the front slowly lowered her phone completely, no longer recording, just watching, her expression no longer amused but thoughtful, uncertain. Brandon cleared his throat, straightening again, trying to reset the tone. "We are done here," he said, more firmly this time, and he reached out as if to slide the bill back toward Elias. But his fingers stopped just short of touching it. Hovering there in that same space he had hesitated in before, Elias did not move his hand either, did not pull back, did not push forward, he simply watched, and the stillness between their hands felt heavier than any motion could have been. Nina shifted her weight behind the register, her heart beating a little faster now, because she understood something Brandon did not yet see. Something about how moments like this did not just disappear when you told them to, especially not when they had already been seen, recorded, and marked somewhere beyond the walls of this store. The small alert icon blinked once on her screen, then again, steady, patient, and she knew that meant the system was not just observing anymore, it was waiting. Brandon finally withdrew his hand, a fraction too quickly, and forced a short laugh that did not spread this time. "Seriously, man, take your money," he said, but the words felt thinner now, less like a command and more like a request he did not want to admit he was making. Elias glanced down at the bill for the first time since placing it there, then back up at Brandon, his expression unchanged, but his eyes sharper now, focused, as if something had aligned in his mind. Near the back, the office door handle shifted slightly, almost too subtle to notice, and Nina's breath caught as she saw it move. The office door did not open all the way, not yet, it just shifted enough for the latch to release with a soft click that carried farther than it should have, and Nina felt it in her chest before she fully saw it. That slight movement in the corner of her vision confirming what the blinking alert on her screen had already told her. Brandon did not turn immediately, he was still focused on the counter, on the bill, on the man in front of him, trying to hold the moment together with posture alone. But the air had changed again, thinner now, like something unseen had stepped into the room. Elias noticed it without looking, the way his eyes stayed on Brandon, but his attention widened, as if he could sense the shift behind him, and his fingers flexed once against the edge of the counter, not nervous, just ready. Nina cleared her throat softly, a small sound that almost disappeared under the hum of the lights, but Brandon heard it, and that was enough to pull his gaze sideways, then over his shoulder, and when he saw the door slightly ajar, his expression flickered, quick and controlled, but real. "We are fine out here," he said, a little louder than necessary, directing the words toward the back even though no one had fully stepped out yet, and the attempt to sound in control only made the silence that followed feel heavier. Elias's eyes moved then, briefly, just enough to register the open line of the door, the darker interior of the office beyond it, and something like recognition passed across his face, not of a person, but of a pattern, like he had seen this exact kind of moment before in a different place, a different time. The $5 bill remained exactly where he had placed it, edges still flat, untouched, and the longer it sat there, the more it seemed to anchor everything else, the arguments that had not been made, the laughter that had faded, the tension that now stretched quietly between everyone in the store. A customer near the front shifted their weight, the faint squeak of rubber soles against tile breaking the stillness for a second, and then settling again. Brandon turned back, faster this time, as if the glance behind him had unsettled something he did not want to acknowledge, and he reached again toward the bill, this time actually touching it, his fingers pressing lightly against the paper, sliding it an inch toward Elias with a controlled motion that tried to look casual. "Take it," he said, his voice lower now, tighter. "This is over." But the words did not land the way he intended. They felt like they were chasing something that had already moved past them. Elias looked down at the bill as it shifted, then at Brandon's hand still resting near it. And for a brief second his expression softened, not in surrender, but in something closer to understanding, as if he could see exactly how hard Brandon was trying to hold onto a version of the moment that no longer existed. Nina's eyes flicked between them, then back to her screen, where the alert icon blinked again, and beneath it a small line of text updated silently, indicating that access had escalated. That someone with higher clearance was now actively watching, not just passively connected. She felt her pulse quicken, not out of fear but anticipation, because she knew what usually followed that kind of change, and she knew Brandon did not. The office door opened a fraction more, slow enough that it almost seemed accidental, and the edge of a polished shoe became visible in the gap, unmoving, as if whoever stood there was choosing to wait, to observe a few seconds longer before stepping in. Elias's gaze returned fully to Brandon, steady as before, and he lifted his hand from the counter at last, not to take the money, but to rest it loosely at his side, the motion small but significant, like a decision made without needing to be announced. "I told you," he said quietly, and there was no edge in it, no satisfaction, just a simple statement that carried more weight now than it had when he first said it. "I am not trying to make a point," and the words hung there, not challenging, not retreating, just existing. Brandon's jaw tightened again, and he let out a short breath, his eyes flicking once more toward the back before snapping forward, as if he could feel the presence there even without fully turning to face it. Around them, the store remained suspended in that same strange quiet, customers no longer pretending to browse, employees no longer moving, everyone caught in the same held breath that had been building since the first laugh. The faint tap of rain against the glass doors continued, steady, indifferent, marking time in a way that felt almost deliberate. Brandon straightened once more, pulling his hand back from the bill, and forced his voice into something firmer, something that sounded like authority even if it no longer felt like it. "Then what do you want?" he asked, and for the first time since the moment began, the question sounded real. Elias did not answer right away, his eyes holding on Brandon for a beat longer than expected, and then shifting, just slightly, past him toward the opening office door, where the shadow behind it had finally started to move. The shadow behind the office door moved with intention now, not hurried, not dramatic, just a steady step forward that carried a different kind of weight than anything else in the room, and the polished shoe that had been half hidden crossed the threshold fully, followed by the quiet presence of a man who did not need to raise his voice to be noticed. Nina straightened instinctively, her posture aligning without thought, because she recognized him before she even saw his face clearly, the kind of recognition that came from training videos, from framed photos in back offices, from the subtle way managers adjusted their tone when his name was mentioned. Brandon turned just enough to catch the movement, and in that fraction of a second, the confidence he had been trying to rebuild slipped again, not disappearing, but thinning, like a surface stretched too far. Elias did not turn immediately, his gaze still resting on Brandon as if giving him one last chance to answer his own question. And the $5 bill remained between them, unchanged, a quiet witness to everything that had been said and everything that had not. The man from the office stepped fully into the store now, his shoes making almost no sound against the tile, his expression neutral, composed, the kind that revealed nothing but suggested everything was being seen. A faint reflection of the overhead lights traced across his glasses as he paused just inside the doorway, taking in the scene without interrupting it, his eyes moving from Brandon, to the bill, to Elias, then briefly to Nina, who gave the smallest nod before looking back down at her register. The air felt tighter now, not because anyone had spoken, but because something unspoken had arrived, something that made every movement more deliberate. Brandon cleared his throat again, this time softer, and turned more fully, forcing a quick, polite smile that did not reach his eyes. "Sir, everything is under control," he said, the words coming out smoother than before, practiced, but just a shade too fast. The man did not respond right away, did not confirm or deny, he simply stepped a little closer, closing part of the distance between himself and the counter, and that small movement shifted the balance of the room more than any raised voice could have. Elias finally turned then, slowly, acknowledging the presence behind him, and for the first time since he walked in, there was a hint of something new in his expression, not surprise, not relief, but recognition of a different kind of audience, one that did not laugh, one that did not need to. The man's gaze met Elias's for a brief moment, steady and assessing, and then returned to the counter, to the $5 bill resting there with its edges still perfectly aligned. "What is happening here?" he asked, his voice calm, even, not loud, but it carried in a way that made everyone else instinctively quiet. Brandon answered quickly, stepping slightly to the side as if to position himself between the man and Elias. "Just a misunderstanding, nothing serious," he said, his tone carefully measured, but the words felt smaller now, like they had to pass through too much tension to come out intact. Nina's fingers hovered over her register again, not moving, because she knew this was the point where things either resolved cleanly or shifted in a way that could not be undone. Elias looked from the man to Brandon, then back again, and his shoulders settled, not in resignation, but in clarity, as if the question that had just been asked had given him permission to answer something he had been holding back. The rain outside continued its soft rhythm against the glass, steady, patient, a quiet backdrop to the moment unfolding inside. A customer near the door took a small step back, creating just a little more space, as if sensing that whatever came next would not need an audience pressed too close. Brandon gestured lightly toward the bill, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "He is just trying to make a scene," he said, the word scene hanging awkwardly in the air, because it no longer fit what was actually happening. Elias's eyes rested on him for a beat, then shifted to the man who had stepped out of the office, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm as before, but now there was a quiet certainty beneath it, something grounded, something that did not need to be raised to be heard. "He asked what I wanted," Elias said. His words simple, direct, and the room seemed to lean into them, waiting. The man from the office did not interrupt, did not redirect, he simply watched, giving the space for the answer to come fully into the open. Elias's gaze dropped briefly to the $5 bill, then lifted again, not to Brandon this time, but to the man standing behind him, and for a moment, the entire store seemed to hold its breath as if it understood that whatever he said next would change the shape of everything that followed. Then Elias drew in a slow breath, steady and unforced, and began to speak. "There is a man outside who cannot feel his hands," Elias said, his voice steady, not urgent, but carrying a quiet weight that shifted the room in a different direction, away from the counter, away from the $5 bill, toward something just beyond the glass doors. The words did not land like an argument, they landed like a fact, simple and unmoving, and for a second no one responded. As if the store itself needed to catch up to what had just been said, the man from the office turned his head slightly toward the entrance, his eyes narrowing just enough to focus past the reflection of fluorescent lights on the glass, and the faint outline of a figure sitting near the wall outside came into view, barely noticeable before, easy to ignore if no one pointed it out. Brandon blinked, the shift in topic catching him off balance. "What are you talking about?" he said, his tone sharper now, not because he was confident, but because he was trying to regain ground that had already slipped. Elias did not look at him this time, his attention remaining on the man who had asked the question. "He has been sitting there for at least 10 minutes. Elias continued, his voice calm, measured. "He is not asking for anything, he is just trying to stay out of the rain," and the simplicity of the statement made it harder to dismiss, because there was no accusation in it, no attempt to win, just an observation that had been waiting to be spoken. Nina's eyes moved quickly toward the door, her breath catching as she focused past the reflections and saw the shape more clearly now, an older man. Shoulders hunched, hands tucked close to his body, not moving much at all. The automatic door slid open briefly as a customer stepped out, and a gust of cool air swept in, carrying the damp scent of rain and something else, something faint but unmistakable, the kind of stillness that clings to someone who has been sitting too long without warmth. The man from the office took a small step forward, his attention fully shifted now, and the room followed that movement. The center of gravity no longer at the counter but at the threshold between inside and outside. Brandon glanced toward the door, then back at Elias, as if trying to decide whether this was another kind of play, another way to redirect the moment. "That has nothing to do with this," he said quickly, gesturing vaguely between them, but the words felt disconnected now, like they belonged to a conversation that had already ended. Elias's gaze returned to him briefly, not confrontational, just steady. "It has everything to do with it," he said, and for the first time there was a hint of something deeper in his tone, not anger, but conviction, something rooted in a place that did not shift easily. Nina's fingers curled lightly against the edge of the counter, her attention no longer on the register at all, because the shape outside had stopped being background. It had become part of the moment, part of the question that was now hanging in the air. The $5 bill remained where it was, almost forgotten now, its earlier weight replaced by something else, something less visible but far more pressing. The man from the office moved closer to the glass doors, his reflection overlapping with the figure outside, and he paused there, looking through, not just seeing but assessing, the way someone does when they understand that what comes next matters beyond a single moment. Brandon shifted again, a small step backward this time, his posture adjusting without him fully realizing it, as if the ground beneath him had subtly changed. Elias remained where he was, not following, not pushing, simply allowing the focus to move where it needed to go, his presence still steady, still grounded, as if he had already made his decision long before he walked into the store. The rain continued its soft rhythm against the glass, and for a second it felt louder than everything else, a quiet reminder of the world just outside the door. A customer near the entrance stepped aside, creating a clearer line of sight, and the figure outside shifted slightly, slow, almost unnoticeable, but enough to confirm what Elias had said. The man from the office reached for the door handle, his fingers resting there for a brief moment before pulling it open, and the cool air rushed in again, sharper this time, carrying with it the full weight of the outside. He stepped just past the threshold, his gaze fixed on the man sitting against the wall, and the store behind him held its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. Then Nina's voice, barely above a whisper, broke the silence from behind the counter. "Sir, his hands," Nina said softly, the words barely rising above the hum of the lights, but they reached the man at the door, and he paused just outside, turning slightly as if to listen more carefully. The rain tapped against the awning above him, a steady, hollow rhythm, and the older man sitting against the wall did not look up, his shoulders drawn inward, his hands tucked close to his chest in a way that was not just about comfort but necessity. Elias stepped forward then, not quickly, not dramatically, just one step that brought him closer to the doorway, and the shift was enough for everyone inside to feel the change again, the moment stretching outward beyond the counter, beyond the bill, into something that mattered more than what had started it. Brandon stayed where he was, his eyes flicking between Elias and the door, his posture caught between following and holding back, as if he had not yet decided which version of himself to be. The man from the office crouched slightly near the older man, his voice low and calm, asking something that did not fully carry inside, but the tone was clear, careful, attentive. The older man responded with a small movement, his head lifting just enough to acknowledge the presence, his lips moving slowly, and though the words were not audible, the effort behind them was. Elias reached the doorway and stopped just inside, not stepping out yet, his gaze focused, his body angled in a way that kept him present both inside and outside, bridging the two spaces without forcing either. "He needs warmth," Elias said, not raising his voice, but the words carried, simple and direct, and something hot, even just broth, and the suggestion did not sound like an instruction, it sounded like something already decided. Nina moved before anyone told her to, her hands already turning toward the small prep area behind the counter where the microwave sat, where cups and lids were stacked neatly, where small containers of soup were kept for quick service, and her movements were faster now. Not rushed, but purposeful. Brandon watched her, his brow tightening slightly. "Nina, wait," he said, the words coming out reflexively, but they lacked the authority they might have held earlier, and she did not stop, not this time. The man from the office glanced back briefly, catching the motion behind him, and then returned his attention to the older man, his hand hovering near the man's shoulder without touching, as if gauging what was needed before acting. The automatic door remained open, held by the presence of bodies moving in and out of its path, and the cool air continued to drift inside, brushing against the counter, against the forgotten bill, against Brandon's sleeve. Elias stepped just outside then, closing the distance by a few feet, and knelt slightly, not too close, not crowding, just enough to meet the older man at eye level, and when he spoke again, his voice softened even further. "You are all right," he said, the word simple, steady, carrying a reassurance that did not depend on volume. The older man's hands shifted slightly, slow and stiff, and Elias noticed the way his fingers struggled to move, the way his breathing stayed shallow, and he adjusted his position just a little, creating a small barrier between the man and the wind without making a show of it. Inside, Nina filled a cup, the faint scent of warm broth rising As steam curled into the air, and she placed a lid on it with careful hands, as if the act itself required precision beyond its simplicity, Brandon took a step toward the door, then stopped, his gaze moving from Elias to the man from the office, trying to read something, to find a cue that would tell him how to proceed, but none came. The store remained quiet, the earlier laughter replaced by a different kind of attention, one that did not look for entertainment but for understanding. Nina carried the cup toward the door, her steps measured to keep the liquid steady, and when she reached Elias, she hesitated just long enough for him to take it, their hands brushing briefly in the exchange. Elias held the cup carefully, testing the warmth with his palm before offering it to the older man, guiding it gently into his hands, making sure his fingers could hold it without strain. The man from the office watched closely, his expression unchanged but his focus sharp, taking in every detail, every movement, every choice. Brandon stood just inside the doorway now, the cool air brushing against his face, his earlier confidence nowhere to be found, replaced by something quieter, something that did not yet have a name. The older man's hands closed slowly around the cup, and for a moment, nothing else moved. Then Elias glanced back toward the counter. Elias's glance toward the counter was not hurried, not distracted, it was precise, as if he had remembered something important and trusted it to still be there, and inside the store the $5 bill lay exactly where he had left it, untouched, flat against the surface, holding its quiet place in a moment that had already moved far beyond it. Brandon followed that glance almost instinctively, his eyes landing on the bill, and for a brief second his expression tightened, not from anger, but from recognition, because the small piece of paper now felt heavier than anything he could say. The man from the office shifted slightly beside Elias, his posture still composed, but his attention divided now between the older man holding the cup and the space behind them where everything had begun. Nina remained near the doorway, her hands loosely clasped, watching as the older man adjusted his grip around the warm cup, his fingers slow but steadier than before, the faint steam rising and catching in the cool air. The rain softened just slightly, the rhythm against the awning easing, and with it the tension inside seemed to loosen by a fraction, not disappearing, just changing shape. Elias kept his focus on the older man for a moment longer, making sure the cup was secure, that the warmth had settled into his hands, and then he straightened slowly, his movements careful, unhurried, as if there was no need to rush anything now. Brandon stepped back from the doorway, just one step, creating space without fully retreating, his eyes moving again between Elias and the counter, as if trying to understand how the moment had shifted so completely without him noticing when it happened. A customer near the aisle exhaled quietly, the sound almost lost in the background, but it marked a change, a release of something that had been held too long. Elias turned then, stepping back inside, the cool air brushing past him as the automatic door slid closed behind, sealing the warmth of the store once again, and as he crossed the threshold, his presence brought the focus with him, guiding the attention back to where it had started. The man from the office followed a step behind, not rushing ahead, allowing Elias to re-enter first, his gaze steady, observant, as if the order of movement mattered. Nina moved slightly to the side to give them room, her eyes flicking once more toward the register, toward the screen that still displayed the silent alert, then back to the counter where the bill remained. Brandon straightened again, his shoulders squaring, but the motion lacked its earlier sharpness. It was slower now, more deliberate, as if he was aware that every movement was being seen in a way it had not been before. Elias approached the counter, stopping at the same spot he had stood before, the distance unchanged, but the meaning of the distance entirely different now. He looked at the bill for a brief second, then lifted his gaze to Brandon, not with challenge, not with triumph, just with the same calm attention that had been there from the beginning. The store held that quiet again, but it was not the same quiet as before. It was fuller, layered with what had just happened outside, with the warmth of the cup, with the recognition that something simple had shifted everything. The man from the office stepped closer to the counter now, his presence aligning with Elias's position rather than opposing it, and the subtle change in alignment did not go unnoticed by anyone watching. Brandon's eyes flicked between them, then to the bill, then back again, his breath shallow for a moment before he steadied it, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, more controlled. "So that is what this was about?" he asked. But the question sounded different now, less like a dismissal and more like an attempt to understand. Elias's gaze did not waver, and for a moment he did not answer, allowing the question to settle in the space between them, allowing Brandon to hear it fully. Nina shifted her weight slightly, her attention fixed on the two men, because she could feel that the moment was not over, that something else was about to be said, something that would not be undone. The faint hum of the lights returned to the foreground, steady and constant, grounding the scene in something ordinary even as it felt anything but. Elias finally reached out, his fingers moving toward the $5 bill, but instead of taking it back, he adjusted it slightly, aligning it more carefully with the edge of the counter, the motion small, almost precise, as if he were placing it exactly where it needed to be. Brandon watched the movement closely, his expression tightening again, not in resistance, but in anticipation, as if he sensed that this simple action carried a meaning he had not yet grasped. The man from the office remained still, his gaze moving from the bill to Elias's hand, then to Brandon. Following the line of the moment as it unfolded, Elias withdrew his hand slowly, leaving the bill exactly where it was, and lifted his eyes once more, meeting Brandon's gaze with quiet certainty, as if the answer to the question had already been given, just not in the way Brandon expected. For a second, no one spoke, and in that silence, the weight of everything that had happened settled fully into place. Then Brandon glanced down at the bill again, and something in his expression changed. Brandon's eyes stayed on the bill longer this time, not because he wanted to, but because he could not seem to pull them away, and the longer he looked, the less it resembled money and the more it felt like a mirror, reflecting something he had not planned to see. His fingers twitched slightly at his side, as if remembering the moment he had almost touched it, almost claimed it, and the hesitation from earlier returned, sharper now, harder to ignore. Elias did not speak, did not move, he simply held his position with a quiet steadiness that filled the space more than any words could have, and that stillness forced Brandon to stay in the moment rather than escape it. The man from the office shifted his weight subtly, his presence now fully aligned with the counter, not interrupting, not guiding, just observing with a focus that made every detail matter. Nina remained just off to the side, her attention fixed on Brandon, because she could see it now, the exact point where something inside him was starting to bend, not break, but bend in a way that could not easily return to its original shape. The store around them felt quieter than before, not empty, but attentive, the kind of silence that comes when people realize they are witnessing something they did not expect to matter. Brandon inhaled slowly, his chest rising, then falling, and when he finally looked up from the bill, his eyes did not carry the same certainty they had earlier. They searched instead, moving briefly to Elias, then to the man from the office, then back again, as if trying to locate the version of the moment he could still control. "You set this up," he said, the words coming out softer than intended, less accusation and more confusion, like he was testing the idea as he spoke it. Elias's expression did not change, but there was a faint shift in his eyes, something that suggested he understood the thought without needing to correct it directly. "No," he said simply, and the word did not push back, it settled, leaving space for Brandon to hear it fully. The answer hung there, uncomplicated, and that simplicity made it harder to argue with, because there was nothing to dismantle, nothing to twist. Brandon's gaze flicked once more toward the door, toward the place where the older man now sat with a cup of warmth in his hands, then back to the counter, and something in that glance connected, a line forming between what had happened outside and what had started inside, and for a brief second, understanding crossed his face, quick and uncomfortable. Nina saw it, the moment it landed, and she held her breath without realizing it, because she knew this was the point where he could either look away or finally see. The man from the office took a small step closer, not imposing, just narrowing the distance enough that his presence could no longer be ignored, and when he spoke, his voice remained calm, even, but there was a weight to it now that had not been there before. "What did you say to him?" he asked, not looking at Elias, but at Brandon, and the question was not about the words themselves, it was about the choice behind them. Brandon opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, the memory of his own voice replaying in his mind, louder now than it had sounded in the moment, stripped of laughter, stripped of performance, leaving only what it actually was. The $5 bill sat between them, unchanged, but it no longer felt like a challenge, it felt like evidence, quiet and undeniable. Elias's gaze remained steady, not pressing, not demanding, simply present, allowing Brandon the space to answer or not answer, to face it or step away from it. A faint hum from the refrigerator units filled the silence, grounding the moment in something ordinary even as it felt anything but. Brandon's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension shifting, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different, less sharp, more measured, as if he were choosing each word instead of throwing them out. "I was joking," he said, but even as he said it, the word felt thin, unable to carry the weight of what had actually happened. The man from the office held his gaze for a moment, not responding immediately, and in that pause, The inadequacy of the explanation settled into the space between them. Nina's eyes moved briefly to Elias, then back to Brandon, because she could see that the moment was not finished, that something else was still unfolding beneath the surface. Elias shifted his weight slightly, the movement small but noticeable, and for the first time since returning to the counter, he spoke again, his voice calm, grounded. "You were not joking," he said. Not accusing, not raising his tone, just stating it in the same way he had stated everything else, as if truth did not need to be louder to be heard. Brandon's eyes met his, and for a second, there was no room left to look anywhere else, no distraction, no laughter, no performance, just the simple, uncomfortable clarity of being seen. The rain outside had nearly stopped now, the tapping against the glass fading into occasional drops, and the quiet that followed felt deeper, more settled. Brandon glanced down at the bill one more time, then back up. And this time, the look in his eyes was not about control or deflection, it was about something else entirely, something he had not planned for. His lips parted slightly, as if he were about to say something different. Brandon's lips parted, but the words did not come out right away, and in that brief hesitation, something unfamiliar settled into his expression, something that did not belong to the version of him that had laughed earlier, something quieter, more uncertain. He glanced at the bill again, then at Elias, and then finally at the man from the office, as if the order of where he looked might help him find the right way to respond, but it did not. It only made the silence stretch longer. The man from the office did not rush him, did not fill the gap. He simply stood there with that same composed stillness, his attention steady, giving Brandon the space to either step forward or retreat into something easier. Nina shifted slightly behind the counter, her fingers resting lightly against the edge, her breathing slow, because she could feel the moment turning, not sharply, not dramatically, but in a way that would not reverse once it settled. The hum of the light seemed louder now, the faint buzz filling the space where Brandon's voice had once been, and the absence of that earlier confidence was more noticeable than the confidence itself had been. Brandon finally drew in a breath, deeper this time, and when he spoke, his voice had changed, not completely, but enough that it no longer carried the same edge. "I did not think," he began, then stopped, the sentence falling apart before it could finish, because whatever he had thought before no longer seemed to fit the reality in front of him. Elias did not interrupt, did not help him finish, he simply watched, his presence steady, allowing the unfinished words to remain unfinished. The man from the office tilted his head slightly, not in judgment, but in attention, as if he were listening for something beneath the words rather than the words themselves. Brandon's gaze dropped briefly to the counter, to the clean surface, to the bill, to the faint reflection of his own hand in the polished edge, and when he looked back up, there was a flicker of something else there, something closer to honesty than anything he had shown so far. "I did not think it mattered," he said finally, the words quieter now, not projected, not performed, just spoken, and they landed in the room with a different kind of weight, because they were not trying to defend anything, they were revealing something. Nina's breath caught softly, not because the statement was loud, but because it was clear, and clarity has a way of cutting through noise without raising its voice. Elias's eyes held on Brandon, and for a moment there was no reaction, no immediate response, just a steady presence that allowed the words to exist without being softened or dismissed. The man from the office shifted his stance slightly, his shoes making a faint sound against the tile, and he stepped closer to the counter, narrowing the distance between himself and Brandon until the space felt more direct, more defined. "It always matters," he said, his voice calm, not raised, but firm in a way that did not need emphasis, and the simplicity of the statement made it harder to deflect, because it did not argue, it stated. Brandon swallowed, the motion small but visible, and his shoulders lowered just a fraction, as if something inside him had finally stopped pushing back. His eyes moved again, this time not searching, but settling, landing on Elias and staying there, and in that stillness, the earlier layers of performance, of control, of casual dismissal, seemed to fall away, leaving something more exposed. The $5 bill remained between them, unchanged, but its meaning had shifted again, no longer a challenge, no longer evidence, but something closer to a marker, a point in time where a choice had been made and could not be unmade. Elias's gaze softened just slightly, not in approval, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement, as if he recognized the shift without needing to name it. The store remained quiet, but it was not the same kind of quiet as before. It was steadier now, less tense, as if the room itself had adjusted to a new balance. A faint drop of water slid from the edge of Elias's coat onto the floor, the small sound grounding the moment in something physical, something real. Brandon exhaled slowly, his breath leaving him in a way that seemed to take some of the earlier tension with it. And for the first time since the moment began, he did not look like he was trying to control what came next. Nina glanced briefly toward the door, where the older man still sat with the cup in his hands, then back to the counter, her expression thoughtful, as if she were holding both moments at once. The man from the office remained still, his presence steady, his gaze moving once between Elias and Brandon. Following the line of what had just been said, Brandon's eyes dropped to the bill one more time, then lifted again. And this time, when he spoke, there was no edge left, no performance, just a quiet recognition that had not been there before. I should not have said it, he admitted, the word simple, direct, and for a second, the room seemed to settle even further, as if something essential had finally been acknowledged. Elias held his gaze, the space between them no longer tense, but not resolved either, just open, waiting. The man from the office shifted slightly, his attention sharpening again, as if the moment had reached a point where a decision beyond words was about to be made. Brandon's hand moved slowly toward the counter, hovering near the bill, not to take it, not yet, but close enough that the intention was clear. His fingers hesitated there, and then he looked up at the man from the office, as if understanding that what came next was no longer his alone to decide. The air in the store felt still, held in that quiet balance between what had been said and what had yet to happen. Then the man from the office finally spoke again. The man from the office did not raise his voice, did not step forward in a way that demanded attention, but when he spoke, the entire room leaned into it without realizing. Brandon, he said, using his name in a tone that carried neither anger nor warmth, just clarity. Step back from the counter, and the instruction was simple, almost quiet, but it left no room for interpretation. Brandon hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hand still hovering near the bill, and then he withdrew it slowly, taking a step back as told, not because he was forced to, but because something in the moment had shifted beyond his control, and he knew it. The distance between him and the counter was small, just a couple of feet, but it felt larger, like a line had been drawn that he was no longer standing on the same side of. Elias did not move, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, but there was a subtle release in his shoulders, not relief, but acknowledgement that the moment had moved into a different phase, one that did not require him to hold it alone anymore. Nina watched closely, her hands resting still now, because she understood that what was happening was not just about what had been said, but about what would be done next. The man from the office stepped forward then, closing the space Brandon had just left, his attention moving briefly to the bill, then to Elias, and finally back to Brandon, as if connecting each piece before speaking again. You do not get to decide when something matters, he said, his tone even, measured, but carrying a weight that settled deeply into the room, and there was no accusation in it, only a statement of fact that could not be argued away. Brandon lowered his gaze for a moment, the words landing in a place that did not allow for easy defense, and when he looked up again, there was something different in his expression, something quieter, something that had not been there before. Outside, the older man shifted slightly, the cup still in his hands, and the faint movement caught Nina's eye, reminding her that the moment was not contained to the store alone, that it extended beyond the glass, beyond the walls, into something more real. Elias followed that movement briefly with his eyes, then returned his attention to the counter, to the man in front of him, and there was no urgency in him, no need to push for resolution, just a steady presence that allowed the moment to unfold at its own pace. The man from the office placed his hand lightly on the counter, not near the bill, but beside it, as if acknowledging its place without claiming it, and he turned slightly toward Elias, his gaze steady. You came in for something simple, he said, and it was not a question, it was an understanding. Elias nodded once, a small, controlled motion. Yes, he said, and that single word carried everything it needed to. Nina felt her breath steady, the tension in her chest easing just slightly, because the direction of the moment was becoming clearer now, less uncertain, more grounded. Brandon shifted his weight again, his hands now at his sides, no longer reaching, no longer gesturing, and the absence of those movements made his stillness more noticeable, more honest. The hum of the store returned softly, the background sounds reasserting themselves as the sharp edge of the earlier tension dulled into something more reflective. The man from the office glanced once toward the door, toward the older man outside, then back to Elias, and there was a brief pause, a moment where everything seemed to align, the inside and the outside, the words and the actions, the before and the after. We will take care of him, he said, not loudly, but with a certainty that did not need emphasis, and the statement shifted something in the air, not dramatically, but enough that it could be felt. Elias's gaze held on him for a second, and there was a faint change there, something softer, not approval, not gratitude, but recognition that the responsibility had been acknowledged. Brandon looked up at that, his eyes moving between them, and for the first time, he seemed to understand that the moment was no longer about him at all, that it had moved beyond his earlier words, beyond his control, into something larger. Nina nodded slightly, almost to herself, and turned just enough to signal toward the back, already thinking ahead to what would need to be done. The $5 bill remained where it was, unchanged, but now it felt less like a challenge and more like a reminder, a small, quiet marker of where everything had turned. Elias shifted his weight slightly, the movement subtle, and then he reached toward the counter again, his fingers moving not with hesitation, but with intention. Brandon's eyes followed that motion. Instinctively, his attention drawn back to the bill, to the hand approaching it, and something in his expression tightened, not in resistance, but in anticipation. The man from the office remained still, watching, allowing the moment to complete itself without interruption. Elias's fingers hovered just above the bill for a brief second, and then he made a choice. Elias did not take the bill back, not the way Brandon expected, not the way anyone watching might have assumed. Instead, his fingers lowered gently, pressing the edge of it flat once more against the counter as if confirming its place, and then he slid it forward, not toward himself, but across the surface, past the invisible line that had once divided them, until it rested closer to the man from the office. The movement was quiet, almost precise, and yet it carried more weight than any words spoken so far, because it was not about the money anymore, it was about what the money had come to represent. Brandon's eyes followed the motion, his breath catching slightly as the bill moved away from him, and for a brief moment he looked as if he might say something, but nothing came, because there was no argument left that could reshape what had already happened. The man from the office glanced down at the bill as it stopped near his hand, then back up at Elias, his expression unchanged, but his attention sharper now, recognizing that this was not a return, not a withdrawal, but a choice. Elias lifted his gaze to meet his, calm and steady, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet certainty that had guided every word before. "It is not for the bet," he said, and the simplicity of the sentence cut through any remaining assumption, leaving only what was true. Nina felt her chest tighten slightly at that, not in discomfort, but in recognition, because she understood what he was doing even before he finished. Elias's eyes shifted briefly toward the door, toward the older man still seated outside with the cup in his hands, then returned to the counter. "Use it for him," he added, and the words were not framed as a request, not softened into suggestion. They were offered plainly, as if the right thing did not need to be negotiated. The store remained still, but the quiet had changed again, deepening into something that felt almost warm, almost steady, as if the moment had finally found its center. Brandon's shoulders lowered further, the tension that had once held him upright now gone, replaced by something quieter, something heavier, and when he looked at the bill again, it no longer felt like something he had lost, but something he had misunderstood from the beginning. The man from the office rested his hand lightly on the counter beside the bill, not covering it, not claiming it, just acknowledging its presence. And then he nodded once, a small, deliberate motion that carried more agreement than any long explanation could have. "We will," he said, his voice calm, steady, and for the first time since he had stepped out of the office, there was a hint of something softer in his tone, something that recognized not just the situation, but the person in front of him. Nina moved then, quietly, already turning toward the back again, this time with purpose that felt different from before, more grounded, more certain, as if the direction of what needed to happen had been fully set. Elias withdrew his hand from the counter, letting the bill remain where it was, no longer connected to him, no longer part of the exchange that had begun this moment, and he stepped back slightly, creating space without stepping away completely. Brandon watched him, his eyes following that small movement, and for the first time, there was no trace of dismissal, no hint of the earlier tone, just a quiet awareness of the distance between who he had been a few minutes ago and who he was now standing there, outside. The older man shifted again, lifting the cup slightly, the steam still rising faintly into the cool air, and the image held steady in the reflection of the glass, visible from where they stood. The man from the office glanced once more toward the door, then back to Brandon, and there was a pause, not empty, but full, as if the moment was offering one last opportunity for something to be said or done. Brandon swallowed, his gaze moving from the bill to Elias, then to the door, and back again, and when he spoke, his voice was low, almost careful. "I understand," he said, though the words sounded less like certainty and more like the beginning of it. Elias met his gaze for a brief second, and there was no judgment. No satisfaction, just a quiet acknowledgement that understanding, even if incomplete, had started. The hum of the lights, the faint scent of warm broth still lingering in the air, the soft rhythm of the last drops of rain outside, all of it settled into a moment that no longer needed to prove anything. Elias turned slightly then, his body angling toward the door, not in haste, not in retreat, just in quiet continuation. As if his part in the moment had reached its natural end. Nina reappeared from the back, her hands already moving with intention, and the man from the office shifted his attention toward her, ready to follow through on what had been set in motion. Brandon remained where he was, his posture no longer rigid, no longer performative, just still, watching as everything he had started resolved without him. Elias took a step toward the door, the movement smooth, unhurried, and as he passed the threshold, the cool air brushed against him once more, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and something else, something quieter, something that lingered. Just before he stepped fully outside, he paused for a fraction of a second. Elias paused at the threshold, not because he was uncertain, but because something in the moment asked for stillness, and the cool air brushing against his face carried the last trace of rain, clean and quiet, settling over everything that had just unfolded. Behind him, the store held its shape, lights steady, voices low, the hum of machines returning to their ordinary rhythm, but the feeling inside it had changed, softened in a way that could not be reset. He turned his head slightly, just enough to look back, not at the counter, not at the bill, but at the people, at Nina standing near the back with a container in her hands, at the man from the office speaking quietly into his phone as he coordinated what needed to be done, and at Brandon, still near the counter, not moving, not speaking, just standing there with a stillness that had replaced everything he had been before. The $5 bill remained on the counter, no longer the center of anything, just a small piece of paper in a place where something larger had happened. Outside, the older man lifted the cup again, his hand steadier now, the warmth doing its quiet work, and Elias stepped fully into the open air, the door sliding closed behind him with a soft, familiar sound. He walked the few steps toward the man, not rushing, not drawing attention, just closing the distance in a way that felt natural, and when he reached him, he lowered himself slightly again, matching the man's level, the way he had before. "It will help," Elias said softly, not as a promise, not as reassurance, just as a simple truth, and the older man nodded faintly, his eyes tired but clearer than before. Inside, Nina moved with purpose, placing items into a small bag, her hand steady now, her movements confident in a way that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done, and the man from the office gave a brief nod in her direction before stepping closer to Brandon. Brandon did not look up immediately, his gaze still fixed somewhere between the counter and the floor, as if he were tracing the outline of a moment he could not step out of yet. And when he finally lifted his eyes, they did not carry defensiveness, they carried something quieter, something closer to reflection. The man from the office spoke to him, his voice low, not carrying beyond the immediate space, but the tone was enough, measured, clear, and Brandon listened without interrupting, without pushing back, his posture still, his shoulders lowered, as if the need to assert himself had finally faded. Outside, the air felt different now, lighter, the rain reduced to a few final drops that clung to the edges of the awning before falling away, and the street beyond moved on as it always did, cars passing, people walking, unaware of what had just shifted in this small space. Elias remained beside the older man for a moment longer, not speaking, not filling the silence, just sharing it, allowing the warmth of the cup, the quiet of the air, and the steadiness of presence to do what words did not need to do. Inside, Nina returned toward the door with a small bag in her hands, pausing briefly as she reached the threshold, her eyes finding Elias for a second, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, not of thanks, not of obligation, just recognition. She stepped outside and handed the bag to the older man carefully, explaining softly what was inside, her voice gentle, practical, and when she stepped back, she glanced once more at Elias, then returned inside, the door sliding closed again behind her. Brandon remained where he was, but something in him had shifted enough that when he looked toward the door now, it was not with dismissal, not with distance, but with a quiet awareness of what he had missed before. The man from the office stood beside him, not imposing, not pressing, just present, allowing the understanding to settle. Without forcing it further, Elias rose slowly, his movements unhurried, and stepped back from the older man, giving him space, not leaving, just allowing the moment to stand on its own. The reflection in the glass door showed both inside and outside at once, the counter, the bill, the figures within, and the two men standing just beyond it, connected by something that did not need to be named. Elias adjusted his coat slightly, the fabric still damp but no longer heavy, and he took a small step back from the door, his eyes moving once more across the scene, taking it in not as something he had changed, but as something that had revealed itself. Inside, Brandon's gaze dropped briefly to the counter one last time, to the place where the bill rested, and then lifted again, slower this time, as if the meaning had finally settled into him fully. The store lights reflected softly on the glass, blending with the fading grey of the sky, and the moment, once sharp and loud, now rested in something quieter, something lasting. Elias turned slightly, his body angling toward the sidewalk, ready to move on, not because the moment was finished, but because it had reached the point where it no longer needed him to hold it. And as he took his first step away, the door behind him opened again, just enough to let a voice follow.